Under the weight of the endless sky, a lone rider moved across the ridges where the wind sang its hollow song. Dust rose behind the hooves of his weary horse, curling into the air like smoke from a long-forgotten fire. His name was Elias Ward, and for 15 years he had carried nothing but a saddle, a rifle, and the silence of grief that never let him go. The trail had become his home, the horizon his only companion, yet the letter folded in his coat burned against his chest with a promise that felt heavier than the revolver at his side. $50 for a ranch, written in the shaky hand of a dying man, and a single warning etched into the page: never abandon what is left behind. The words haunted him as if they were more than a bargain, more than a trade. They felt like the opening of a story that would not let him turn away. The land stretched before him, cruel and beautiful, painted with gold where the sun spilled across the plains. His thoughts wandered back to the woman he had once called his wife, her laughter echoing faintly in the chambers of memory, the kind of sound that both healed and hurt at once. 10 years gone, yet her absence lingered like a scar etched into his very soul. He had promised never to give his heart again, to protect the fragile remains of what once made him whole. And yet here he was, riding toward a place that demanded more than coin, a place where ghosts and promises might entwine to shape a new destiny. When at last the ranch appeared below the ridge, it looked like a shell of forgotten dreams. The house leaned against the years, the porch sagged with neglect, and the barn threatened to collapse into the dust. But there was a stillness, a quiet that hummed with mystery, as though something unseen waited within the walls. Elias dismounted slowly, each step carrying the weight of choices he could not yet name. He touched the door, the wood rough beneath his palm, and felt the echo of lives once lived here. The smell of dust and cedar lingered, the air thick with silence. He placed his saddlebag down, unfolded the letter again, and whispered the words he already knew. Never abandon what is left behind. The meaning gnawed at him, elusive as smoke in the wind. It could have been cattle left untended, broken fences, or a lonely orchard starved of rain. But Elias felt in his bones it was something more, something that pulsed like a hidden heartbeat through the air of this forgotten valley. He stepped outside, listening. The world held its breath. Then came the sound, water splashing, laughter light as wind chimes, quickly silenced. His heart stilled, caught between wonder and unease. Down where reeds kissed the glimmering pond, sunlight danced on rippling water, and there, half hidden in the glow, were 3 young women, their hair dark and glistening, their laughter broken by surprise as their eyes met his. In that instant, Elias understood that the ranch was no ordinary inheritance. It was not the land alone that had been left behind. It was lives, fragile yet resilient, waiting for someone who would not turn away. The letter had not been a contract, but a vow, one he had stepped into without knowing its price. He stood on the porch, watching the sky soften to copper and violet, his heart unsettled, his breath heavy with questions. What he saw was not burden, but possibility, a fragile beginning, like a candle burning against the long dark. The horizon stretched endlessly, but for the first time in years, Elias did not feel only the loneliness of distance. He felt the quiet pull of destiny, an invitation to heal, to protect, to belong. The land, the women, the promise, all wove together into a tapestry of fate he had never dared to dream. As the stars began to bloom across the sky, he knew the trail that once defined him had ended. Another journey, more dangerous and more tender, had begun, and within its folds lay the chance for a home, for love, and for redemption. If this story stirs something gentle in your heart, if it brings you even a moment of peace and healing warmth, let your voice linger here. Leave a like, share your thoughts in a comment, and subscribe for the chapters yet to unfold. Your presence, quiet as it may be, becomes part of the journey, carrying this tale forward beneath the same vast sky. And now, as the night wraps around Elias Ward and the echoes of laughter drift from the house he has just inherited, the path leads into deeper shadows and brighter light, where secrets, longing, and love await to be discovered. The night pressed gently against the valley, quiet except for the rustle of wind slipping through the tall grass. Elias sat on the sagging porch, the worn wood creaking beneath his weight, eyes lifted toward a sky flooded with stars. They were sharp and endless, scattered like fragments of shattered glass across the heavens, each one a reminder of how vast and how lonely the world could be. His horse shifted in the corral, snorting softly, as if echoing his restlessness. He held the letter in his hand again, fingers tracing the ink as though it might change, as though the words might reveal more than they already had. $50. Never abandon what is left behind. The words pulsed with the quiet authority of a vow, the kind a man could not outrun. Inside the house, faint movement stirred. The floorboards whispered under light steps, hushed voices carried low, a reminder that he was no longer the only soul bound to this place. He thought of the three women, their startled eyes when they had seen him by the pond, the way fear had trembled through them like a sudden wind snapping through branches. And yet, beneath that fear, there had been something else too, something fragile, like the shadow of hope. He had seen it in the oldest one's gaze, a defiance stitched together with sorrow, as though life had broken her many times, but not completely. Morning came softly, the horizon brushed in silver and pale gold. Elias rose early, his body still trained to the rhythm of the trail. He fetched water from the well, the rope groaning under the bucket's weight, and felt the sting of cool air against his skin. The house behind him remained quiet until a door opened and Marisol, the eldest, stepped out. Her dark hair hung damp, braided neatly over one shoulder, and her eyes, though wary, carried the depth of someone who had lived too much too soon. She held a tin mug, steam rising from its rim, and offered it without words. Elias accepted it with a nod, the warmth of the coffee seeping into his palms like a small healing gift. They sat together in silence, not uncomfortable, but weighted with the unspoken. Elias could feel her measuring him, gauging whether his presence meant danger or salvation. He drank slowly, letting the heat spread through him, and finally spoke. "Work needs doing," he said softly, eyes drifting toward the barn, the fences half fallen, the land starved of care. She nodded once, the faintest trace of agreement, though her lips did not move. Behind her, Taya emerged, carrying a basket of laundry, her movements brisk, determined, as if eager to prove her worth. Nera, the youngest, followed clumsily, a broom in her hands far too large for her frame. Her laughter spilled into the morning like a fragile melody, sweet and unguarded, cutting through the still air with a kind of innocence that felt almost sacred. Elias watched them quietly, an ache growing inside him. He had known camps of men hardened by trail dust, faces lined with hunger and weariness, but he had not seen this, young women carrying burdens carved too deep for their years, yet still carrying the spark of life. He set his mug aside, stood, and moved toward the corral. His hands found tools, his body fell into the rhythm of work, and each swing of the hammer rang like a prayer for renewal. The wood splintered, nails groaned, but slowly the fence began to rise again. With every strike, Elias felt something within him shift, as if the very act of mending the land was mending him too. Marisol watched from the porch, arms folded, her eyes sharp. At last she spoke, her voice steady but quiet. "You don't ask questions." Elias leaned against the post, wiping sweat from his brow. "I reckon answers come in their own time," he said simply. She lowered her gaze, fingers tightening at the edge of her dress. After a long pause, she began to speak, her words unraveling a story etched in pain. Soldiers had come when she was barely a child, raiding her people's camp, leaving behind blood and ashes. Her parents were taken from her, her sisters dragged beside her into a world that saw them not as daughters, but as property. Years ago, she had been sold like a horse in the market, the weight of chains still echoing in her memory. But then Harlan Reeves had bought them, not to use, not to discard, but to raise. He and his wife had given them food, shelter, names in English, and the closest thing to belonging they had ever known. Elias listened without interruption, each word piercing him like thorns pressed deeper into his skin. He had seen those markets in border towns, had heard men laugh as they bid on lives. He had turned his eyes away then, bitter but powerless, too poor to intervene. And now, here she stood before him, the story no longer an echo in the distance, but flesh and breath, with her sisters moving quietly in the yard. When Marisol's voice faltered, Elias met her gaze. "Then it's you," he said quietly. "You're what he meant, what he didn't want left behind." Her jaw tightened, her eyes shimmering but unbroken. "The law doesn't see us as daughters," she said. "We are still what we were when we came here. Slaves, property, nothing more." The words carved silence between them. Elias stared at the ground, his chest tightening with the weight of understanding. He thought of his wife, of the dreams they had once woven together, a house, children's laughter, roots planted deep into the soil of some quiet land. That dream had died with her, leaving him drifting like a man untethered. But now here, 3 young women stood at the threshold of his life, bound to him by a promise he had not even known he was making, not blood, not kin, but entrusted to him all the same. As the sun climbed higher, Taya approached with hands red from scrubbing cloth, her voice softer than her guarded eyes. "We can work," she said firmly. "We will not be a burden." Nera followed, her laughter spilling again, though her eyes held an unspoken plea for safety, for permanence. Elias swallowed, his throat tight. "You won't be sent away," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of the vow. "Not while I'm here." That evening, as twilight deepened, Elias walked to the hill behind the barn, where 2 graves rested beneath simple wooden crosses. He stood with his hat pressed to his chest, the earth still fresh with grief. "You left me a hard burden, old man," he murmured, voice rough with both anger and tenderness. but maybe it's the kind worth carrying. The wind brushed against him like a healing touch, cool and steady, whispering through the grass as though the land itself approved. When he returned to the house, the sisters were preparing supper, the scent of beans and bread drifting through the air. They spoke in their native tongue, words flowing soft and rhythmic, weaving both comfort and sorrow into the walls of the home. Elias sat at the table with them for the first time, the lamplight flickering, their faces lit with both caution and the faintest trace of belonging. They ate together, the simple act binding them in ways none of them could yet name. As night settled, Elias stretched out on the porch once more, listening to their voices from within, laughter mingling with whispered worries. For the first time in years, he did not feel entirely alone. The silence that had once gnawed at him seemed softer now, shaped not by emptiness, but by the fragile beginnings of something new. He thought of Marisol's story, of Taya's determination, of Nera's innocent light, and he felt the weight of responsibility not as a chain, but as a calling. The land was scarred, the world beyond the fences hostile, but here, within the fragile walls of this ranch, something was stirring, a seed of family, of love, of healing waiting to grow. The dawn that would follow promised labor, hardship, and trials yet unseen, but also the quiet chance to carve a life worth holding on to. And so, as the night breathed its cool blessing over the valley, Elias closed his eyes, knowing that tomorrow he would rise not only for himself, but for them, for the fragile hope that had been placed in his hands, and for the promise he had sworn never to abandon. And with that unspoken vow, the story carried forward, deeper into the shadows of struggle and the light of unexpected tenderness, where love would test its strength against the world itself. The afternoon sun spilled its warmth across the valley, gilding the broken fences and the pale grass with strokes of amber. Elias worked quietly near the corral, his hands rough with the rhythm of hammer and nail, the steady sound ringing like a heartbeat against the silence of the land. Yet his thoughts wandered, restless and uncertain, drawn back to the moment by the pond, when laughter had shattered the stillness and 3 young women had risen from the water, startled and unguarded. The memory of their eyes lingered, filled with both fear and a fragile spark that had pierced deeper than he cared to admit. Marisol carried herself with the grace of someone older than her years, her gaze sharp, her chin lifted against the world as though she dared it to break her again. Taya was fire and movement, her hands never still, her determination a shield against despair. And Nera, the youngest, held laughter as her weapon, scattering it like wildflowers across the weary ground, refusing to let sorrow claim all the space between them. Together they unsettled Elias, not because they threatened him, but because they reminded him of the life he thought forever lost, a life where love and family once healed the aching edges of loneliness. That evening, when the work was done and the first stars blinked awake, they shared a meal at the table. The lamplight glowed across their faces, softening the tension, turning silence into something almost gentle. Elias felt their eyes on him, weighing his presence, measuring whether his promise could be trusted. He kept his voice steady when he said, "This land will not cast you out. You belong here as much as I do." The words hung between them, a vow rooted in the soil beneath their feet, and for the first time he saw the faintest easing in Marisol's guarded stare. Days folded into one another, each marked by work that demanded more than strength. It demanded patience, resilience, and a willingness to heal both land and soul. Elias mended the porch, patched the barn roof, and turned the dry soil with the stubborn hope that something green might grow again. The sisters moved beside him in their own rhythm, Marisol keeping the house alive, her hands firm and precise. Taya in the fields, blistered but unyielding, her pride refusing to let weakness show. Nera chasing chickens, gathering eggs, her laughter brightening the air like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. At night they gathered by the fire, the crackle of flame weaving with their voices. Nera told stories she barely understood, dreams of freedom shaped by innocence, while Taya spoke of wild horses running across deserts she longed to see again. Marisol, though cautious, sometimes let her voice soften when she spoke of Harlan Reeves, of the man who had once sung off-key songs just to make them laugh, of the woman who had brushed their hair with gentle hands before sleep. Elias listened, the memories settling over him like a warm cloak, and found himself offering fragments of his own past. His wife's laughter in a small town hall, the nights when love had filled him with a purpose greater than the trail. His words carried both sorrow and solace, healing in their honesty, and he felt the fragile thread between them grow stronger with each confession. One night, when the stars gleamed like scattered silver, Taya stepped outside to find him on the porch. She sat close, her presence easy, though her voice carried a tension she did not name. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked softly, her gaze drifting toward the endless dark. The trail, the sky without fences. Elias hesitated, his heart heavy with memory. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but the trail's a lonely place. A man can ride for years and find nothing waiting for him at the end. What matters is not the miles, but who's there when you stop." Their eyes met, the unspoken question shimmering between them, and for a moment the air grew thick with longing, neither dared voice. She rose quickly, her hands brushing the folds of her dress. "Good night," she said, and disappeared inside, leaving Elias with an ache sharp enough to remind him how dangerous hope could be. Marisol sensed the shift in him, the way his silence carried more weight than before. She watched him from a distance, measuring the truth of his every action, her strength holding firm even as loneliness shadowed her eyes. Nera, untouched by the same walls her sisters built, leaned toward him with open laughter, her innocence disarming, reminding him of the daughter he had once dreamed of but never held. Each of them stirred something in him, duty, tenderness, the flicker of forbidden desire, and each night he lay awake, torn between the promise of protection and the longing that whispered he was still human, still capable of needing more than solitude. The land itself tested their fragile unity. A storm tore through the valley one evening, scattering shingles and ripping fences apart. Together they fought against the wind, Elias driving stakes into the earth, while Taya held boards in place with bleeding hands, Marisol dragging supplies from the house, Nera clutching chickens and laughing in wild defiance of the chaos. When the storm passed, they stood side by side in the wreckage, bruised and exhausted, but unbroken. Marisol looked up at Elias then, her voice steady. "We are not helpless," she said. "We survived before you came. We will survive again if we must." Elias met her gaze without flinching. "I don't doubt it, but you don't have to do it alone anymore." "Not while I'm here." And for the first time her lips curved with a fleeting, almost reluctant smile, a fragile, healing gesture that carried more weight than words. That night, As the house filled with the scent of bread baking and the sisters' laughter spilled through the walls, Elias felt a change settle inside him. This was no longer about honoring a dying man's letter. It was about protecting what had become his, not through blood or law, but through the quiet weaving of trust, sacrifice, and shared struggle. A family, fragile and unorthodox, had begun to take root in the dust of a forgotten ranch, but peace was never meant to last in such a world. Elias sensed it in the way Marisol sometimes paused at the window, her eyes scanning the horizon as though she expected riders to appear. He saw it in Taya's shoulders, tense whenever strangers passed on the far trail. He heard it in Nera's restless murmurs when the night wind rattled the shutters. The storm outside had passed, but another, born of law, hatred, and fear, was waiting beyond their fences, biding its time. And when it came, Elias knew it would test not only his vow, but the very bond they had begun to build. The night grew quiet again, the stars distant. But in the hush there was no peace, only the certainty of trials yet to come, and the unyielding promise that he would not abandon what had been left behind. The morning came with a softness that belied the weight of what hung over them. A pale mist drifted low across the valley, the sun breaking gently through, spilling gold over the land that still bore scars of storm and silence. Elias rose before the sisters stirred, his boots crunching softly on the dew-damp earth, his breath a cloud in the cool air. He carried tools to the pasture, his hands steady, his mind heavy with the unspoken truth that his life had shifted. Once, the trail had defined him, the endless horizon his only home. Now it was this place, the ranch, the women within its fragile walls, that held him tethered, like roots finally piercing soil. By mid-morning, Marisol joined him, her hair braided tight, her eyes shadowed but resolute. She carried ledgers once kept by Harlan, their pages worn, ink fading, but still marked with the order of a man who had tried to shape wilderness into permanence. He believed numbers could keep the land alive, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Elias took the book in his hands, studying the handwriting, each figure a ghost of the man who had entrusted him with more than dirt and wood. "Numbers don't heal land," Elias murmured. "Hands do, hearts do." Marisol's gaze lingered on him, sharp as a blade, yet softened by something unspoken. She turned back to the house, her shoulders squared, as if she carried not only her sister's futures, but also the weight of deciding whether to trust the man fate had delivered to them. Taya worked beside Elias in the fields that day, her determination fierce, her silence carrying the echo of unvoiced questions. Sweat gathered at her brow, streaking down her temples, yet she did not pause, even when blisters broke across her hands. Elias offered to take the heavier tasks, but she shook her head stubbornly, the fire in her eyes daring him to see her as anything less than equal. He respected her will, though it stirred something deeper, a recognition of her spirit that pressed against the boundaries of his resolve. Their hands brushed once as they lifted a beam together, and the spark that leapt between them was sharp enough to make them both look away. Nera, too young to carry the same burdens, filled the air with her laughter as she darted between chores, chasing chickens that scattered across the yard, gathering eggs in her small hands. She sang softly in her native tongue, a melody that wound around the rough edges of the day, healing in its innocence, reminding them all that joy had not yet been stolen from their lives. Her laughter rang against the walls of Elias's heart, reminding him of what had been lost, and what might yet be found. That evening they gathered again around the table, their meal simple but shared. The firelight softened Marisol's guarded features, turned Taya's defiance into strength rather than resistance, and painted Nera's innocence with a glow that felt like hope itself. Elias found himself speaking of his past, not the sharp edges of grief, but the tender memories, the warmth of a hand in his, the healing sound of laughter shared under lantern light in small town halls, the way a home could feel when filled with voices instead of silence. His words fell gently into the room, and for the first time the sisters leaned closer, listening not as strangers, but as companions bound by the fragile beginnings of trust. Marisol spoke then, her voice slow, deliberate. She told him of the winters when she and her sisters had nursed Harlan and his wife through fever, of the way they had whispered songs to ease their pain, of how the house had felt like it might collapse into emptiness when both graves were dug behind the barn. Her words carried sorrow, but also strength, a reminder that they had endured the unendurable and were still standing. Elias bowed his head, his chest tight, and whispered, "You won't face the next storm alone, not while I have breath." The nights grew warmer as spring unfolded, the land trembling with the promise of renewal. Flowers pushed through soil once hardened by neglect. The fences stood straighter, the barn no longer threatened to collapse. Each day, Elias felt the rhythm of their lives weaving tighter together, the fragile threads of family knitting into something he had thought he would never hold again. But beneath it all, there was tension, a silent pull of emotions that ran deeper than duty. Marisol's strength stirred admiration that edged toward longing. Taya's fire challenged him, igniting sparks he fought to silence. Nera's innocence awakened tenderness that felt like the ghost of a daughter he had never fathered. Each of them pressed against the walls of his solitude, cracking the armor he had carried for so long. One night, beneath a sky thick with stars, Elias sat alone on the porch, a bottle of whiskey at his side, his mind restless with the weight of promises and desires. Taya joined him, her footsteps soft against the boards. She sat near him, the silence between them alive with unspoken words. After a long pause, she asked, "Do you think this place can ever be safe?" Elias stared into the dark fields, the land already marked as his. "Safe?" he echoed. "Maybe not safe, but worth fighting for." Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat the world held only that moment, the warmth of shared determination, the fragile longing neither dared name. She rose quickly, her hands trembling as she brushed her dress. "Good night," she whispered, her voice taut, and slipped back inside, leaving Elias with an ache sharp enough to remind him of how dangerous hope could become. Marisol, ever watchful, sensed the shifts, her gaze lingering longer on Elias when she thought he wasn't looking. She tested him with silence, with questions left unspoken, but he met her eyes each time without flinching, letting his steady presence speak where words might falter. Nera remained the light between them all, her laughter scattering shadows, her innocence weaving a fragile healing that none of them could have survived without. The peace they had carved was tender but fragile, a flame flickering in the wind. They could feel it in the air, the knowledge that the world beyond their fences would not leave them untouched. Whispers carried in from town, shadows stretched long over the land, and riders sometimes passed too slowly along the ridge. Elias felt it most in the quiet moments, when the sisters' laughter faded to silence, and the night seemed to hold its breath. He knew the storm was coming, not of weather, but of men and law, of hatred and fear. Yet even as unease grew, so too did the bond between them. Each shared labor, each meal, each story told in lamplight forged them closer, as though fate itself demanded that they stand as one. Elias felt it when Marisol's hand brushed his as she passed him bread, when Taya's laughter broke free despite her fire, when Nera leaned against him, unafraid, as though she had always belonged at his side. These small moments healed him, mending the jagged edges of loneliness with threads of warmth he had thought lost forever. And so the days passed, weaving together labor, tenderness, and the quiet unfolding of hearts long scarred. But beyond the fences, the world waited, restless and cruel, ready to test what they had built. The promise Elias had made, to never abandon what was left behind, would soon be measured not in words, but in fire and blood. Yet, as he looked at the sisters, laughter spilling through the house, he felt no regret. For the first time in a decade, he had found something worth holding, something worth protecting. And he knew he would not let it go, no matter what storm might rise against them. The days ripened into late spring, the valley breathing easier as green returned to the pastures and the scent of fresh earth filled the air. Morning light spilled across the ranch in soft golden sheets, touching every broken board Elias had mended, every fence he had set upright, every furrow turned beneath his calloused hands. It was not only the land that healed beneath his care, but something deeper, something within himself, long dormant, now stirring again. He moved through each day with a sense of rootedness he had not known since before grief had carved its hollow place inside him. And always, beside him, the sisters worked and lived, their presence a constant reminder that the letter in his pocket was more than words on paper. Marisol carried the weight of her family with a quiet dignity, shoulders squared, though sorrow lived in her eyes. She kept the household in order, her hands steady on every task, her voice calm, even when shadows of fear darkened her gaze. Elias often found himself watching her as she moved, admiring the strength that softened into tenderness when she thought no one was looking. She was fire-wrapped in stillness, the kind of woman who had learned to survive storms by standing unshaken. He felt drawn to her gravity, though he respected the distance she held like armor. Taya burned with restless energy, her will sharp as a blade. She matched Elias in the fields, her body bending to labor with a determination that shamed his doubts. When their eyes met over the strain of a heavy beam or the stubborn resistance of hard soil, there was a spark, a recognition of shared strength, a dangerous whisper of something more. She defied every expectation, refusing to be silent, refusing to be less, and Elias, against his will, found her fire igniting places inside him he had sworn would stay cold. Nera remained the light, the laughter, the one who kept shadows from pressing too close. She skipped through the yard with skirts fluttering, sang softly in her mother tongue as she gathered eggs or fed the animals, and sometimes leaned against Elias's side with a trust so pure it ached. In her he felt echoes of the child he and his wife had once dreamed of, a dream buried but never forgotten. Nera's innocence was not ignorance. She had lived the same grief, the same tearing away. But she chose joy, scattering it like seeds across the harshest ground. Evenings brought them together around the table, where silence slowly gave way to words. At first they spoke only of tasks, the well's depth, the grain's measure, the fences still needing repair. But soon stories slipped free. Tyre spoke of desert winds and wild horses that had once thundered across the plains. Nera told of dreams filled with colors she could not name, visions of freedom rising like dawn. Marisol, when she allowed herself, spoke of Harlan's crooked songs and his wife's soft hands, her voice laced with gratitude and sorrow. Elias listened, sometimes answering with his own memories, nights under endless sky, laughter that had once filled his chest, love that had burned bright before being stolen away. These exchanges stitched them together, thread by thread, until the silence between them felt less like a gulf and more like a bond. But beneath the warmth, beneath the small healing moments, desire stirred quietly, weaving itself into the fabric of their days. Elias felt it when Marisol's hand brushed his as she passed him bread, when Tyre's arm pressed against his in the fields, when Nera's laughter filled the porch and leaned against the silence inside his heart. It was a dangerous undercurrent, one he tried to silence with work, with restraint, with the steady hand of a man who knew the cost of mistakes. Yet the heart is not governed by reason, and each night he lay awake, torn between his vow to protect and the yearning that whispered through his blood. The ranch itself became a teacher. Storms rose again, testing the fences, ripping shingles from the roof, driving the livestock into chaos. Together they fought back, Elias with hammer and rope, Marisol with supplies carried against the wind, Tyre with hands bleeding but unyielding, Nera with her wild defiance and laughter even in the rain. When the storm passed, leaving destruction in its wake, they stood together in the broken yard, chests heaving, eyes shining not with defeat, but with the fierce pride of survival. In that moment, Elias felt the truth settle deep. They were no longer strangers, bound by a dead man's letter. They were family, forged by hardship, healed by shared struggle. One evening, as the sun sank in hues of fire and gold, Elias walked with Marisol to the hill behind the barn. The graves rested there, marked by simple wooden crosses, the earth still whispering loss. He stood with his hat in hand, the air heavy with memory, and murmured, "You left me a hard burden, old man, but maybe it was the right one." Marisol's voice broke the stillness. "He trusted you," she said softly, "perhaps more than he trusted himself." Her hand brushed against his, fleeting but real, and for the first time he allowed the warmth of her presence to seep past the walls he had built. Yet, even as bonds deepened, shadows stretched long over the land. Riders passed too slowly along the ridge. Whispers drifted in from town, and unease grew in Marisol's watchful eyes. Elias felt it too, the sense that their fragile peace was not meant to last, that the world beyond their fences would come knocking soon. Still, he held to the vow he had spoken: never abandon what is left behind. As night fell and laughter once again filled the house, Elias sat on the porch, watching the stars scatter across the velvet dark. For the first time in a decade, the ache inside him was softened by something greater, by belonging, by love unspoken but alive, by the healing warmth of a family not born of blood but of choice. And though the storm of men and law drew closer with every passing day, he knew he would stand firm, The ranch was no longer only land. It was life. It was home. It was the fragile flame of tomorrow. And he would guard it, whatever the cost, as the story carried forward into trials that would demand more than love alone. The valley seemed calm in those days, its silence carrying the fragile peace they had built with calloused hands and weary hearts. Elias woke each morning to the soft creak of boards settling in the house, the muffled stir of the sisters moving within, and the pale light sliding across the hills. His body was bent to work, yet his spirit felt less burdened than it had in years. He repaired what time had broken, set posts into the soil with steady strikes, drew life from the tired earth, and found in each rhythm of labor a strange healing, as if every nail, every board, every seed pressed into the dirt mended something hollow inside him. Marisol moved through those mornings with quiet purpose, her presence a steady flame in the shifting winds of fear. Her gaze was sharp, but carried softness beneath, a tenderness she kept hidden like a treasure too precious to expose. When Elias returned from the fields, his clothes heavy with dust, he sometimes found her at the table, ledger spread open, her fingers tracing numbers that no longer mattered to the land, but tethered her to the memory of the man who had raised her. He would pause, leaning against the doorframe, watching her strength, the line of her jaw, the way her hair caught light in threads of gold against its dark weight. Something in him ached then, quiet but undeniable, a longing that pressed against the vows he had built around his heart. Taya was fire against his restraint. She matched him step for step in the fields, her hands blistered but unyielding, her defiance sparking with each task she refused to yield. Together they lifted beams, turned soil, drove cattle, and in every glance there was a challenge, a silent demand that he see her not as someone in need of protection, but as a partner equal to the storms that beat against them. One afternoon their hands brushed as they strained against a beam, and the spark between them lingered, sharp and unspoken, before they pulled back, both pretending the moment had not cracked something deeper open. Elias lay awake that night, the memory of her closeness burning through the dark, reminding him how thin the line between duty and desire could be. Nera remained a balm against such turmoil. Her laughter spilled through the house, softening every edge, scattering shadows from corners Elias thought would always remain empty. She followed him sometimes as he worked, asking questions with wide-eyed wonder, speaking of dreams she barely understood, dreams of rivers that never ran dry, of skies so wide they could carry sorrow away. She leaned against him without fear, trusting him with the innocence of one who had not yet learned to doubt. In her, Elias felt echoes of the life he had lost, the daughter he and his wife had once imagined, a child who might have brought laughter like this into their home. Nera's presence was healing, a reminder that even after so much had been stolen, joy could still bloom, fragile but resilient, like wild flowers in stone. At night they gathered around the table, the lamplight soft against the walls, the shadows turning their silence into intimacy. They shared stories, small ones at first, of weather, of repairs, of what the land might yield if given time. But soon deeper words surfaced. Elias spoke of his wife, of her laughter that had once filled rooms brighter than any lantern, of the hollow silence her absence had left behind. The sisters listened, their eyes tender, their hearts opening to the man who had once been broken. In return, Marisol spoke of loss, of the soldiers who had torn their family apart, of the long nights when she had held her sisters close, whispering songs to keep fear at bay. Tyre added her anger, her voice like a flame that refused to be smothered. Nera, softer, spoke of dreams that carried them beyond the fences of this land, dreams that reminded them hope was not a lie, but a seed waiting to grow. Through these confessions, bonds deepened, weaving them together not with obligation, but with choice. The air between them grew warmer, charged with emotions none of them dared name, but all of them felt. Elias found his gaze lingering too long on Marisol's strength, too long on Tyre's fire, too tenderly on Nera's laughter. Each drew him in, not with demand, but with the simple, undeniable truth of presence. He told himself his role was protector, nothing more, but the nights betrayed him, the silence pressing against his restraint, reminding him that loneliness could not armor a heart forever. It was not only longing that bound them, it was hardship. The land, unforgiving as always, tested them. A storm came, tearing shingles from the roof, driving rain sideways, battering the fragile fences they had only just mended. Together they fought back, Elias hammering boards into place, Tyre bracing beams against the wind, Marisol hauling supplies with grit in her eyes, Nera clutching chickens and laughing breathlessly as though defying the storm itself. When it passed, leaving ruin in its wake, they stood in the yard soaked and exhausted, but alive, their breaths ragged, their eyes shining with the pride of survival. Marisol looked at Elias then, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "We are not helpless. We were never helpless. We survived before you came. We will survive after, if we must." Elias met her gaze, his voice firm. "You don't have to do it alone anymore. Not while I'm here." For the first time, her lips softened into the ghost of a smile, fleeting but real, a healing gesture that lingered in the air long after the words had faded. The following days brought more labor, but also a strange lightness. They worked side by side, their voices weaving into the rhythm of tasks, their laughter rising like a fragile hymn against the weary land. Elias felt himself drawn closer, not just in duty, but in love, an unspoken, dangerous, tender love that stretched its roots through every moment, every glance, every shared silence. He feared it, but he could not turn from it. The sisters had become his family, his charge, his reason to stay. And somewhere deep within, he knew the world would not forgive such bonds, would come to test them with the cruelty of law and prejudice. But for now, as the stars spilled across the night sky and the sisters' laughter echoed faintly within the house, Elias let the warmth seep into him. He allowed himself to feel the healing pulse of belonging, the fragile sweetness of being part of something more than himself. He did not know how long this peace would last, but he knew one truth with certainty. He would not abandon them. Whatever storm gathered beyond the horizon, he would face it, not as a wanderer, but as a man who had found something worth protecting. And so the night deepened, carrying them forward into the trials that waited just beyond the fragile fences of their reborn home. The day Sheriff Conrad Dawes rode into the valley, the sun was high and merciless, casting sharp shadows across the yard. Elias was sharpening a plough blade when the steady rhythm of hooves reached his ears. He looked up, hand instinctively brushing the grip of his revolver, and saw the dust trail unfurling behind a rider. His stomach tightened before the figure even drew close. The badge gleamed against the man's chest like a blade catching light. Dawes had always been a hard man, unyielding, proud of the law he wielded like a weapon. Elias felt the familiar chill of old memories rise as the sheriff reined in, his eyes sweeping the ranch with the cold certainty of a man who had already passed judgment. The sisters appeared on the porch, their faces tense, the unease that had haunted them surfacing in full. Dawes tipped his hat, though his smile carried no warmth. "Ward," he said flatly, "been a long time since you drifted through my town. Heard you bought yourself Reeves's place." Elias rose slowly, squaring his shoulders. "That's right." The sheriff's gaze slid to the women, his eyes narrowing, his tone sharpening. "And I see you came into company. Reeves's daughters, is it? That's not what the law would call them." Marisol stiffened, but her chin lifted. Elias stepped closer, his voice steady. "They're his daughters by word, if not by blood. This land is theirs as much as mine." The sheriff dismounted, dust curling around his boots. "That's not how the law sees it," he said coldly. "You know what they are. Apache, bought as slaves years ago. By the courts they're property, not heirs, and property can't hold land. Men in town won't stomach it. They'll call it theft, or worse. Best you hand them over now." "We'll keep them where they belong." The silence that followed pressed heavy as stone. Elias's breath thickened in his chest, his mind flashing with images. Marisol's guarded strength crushed under chains, Tyre's fire extinguished in captivity, Nera's laughter silenced forever. He thought of the letter, of Harlan's dying words carved into his soul. "Never abandon what is left behind." His voice broke the stillness like steel striking flint. "No," he said, his jaw tight. "They stay here, with me. This is their home." The sheriff's eyes hardened, his tone sharp as a blade. "Careful, Ward. You've got a past. Don't dig yourself deeper by throwing in with them. You stand against the law. You'll find no friends in this county." Elias met his gaze, unflinching. "I've stood against worse. I won't hand them over." His hand rested near his revolver, steady as the ground beneath him. For a long moment, the air was taut with the weight of violence waiting to break. Then Dawes gave a harsh laugh, mounting his horse once more. "You always were a fool," he spat. "This ain't over. The law doesn't forget." When the sheriff rode away, dust curling in his wake, Elias turned to find the sisters watching him, their eyes wide, their breaths caught between fear and fragile faith. Marisol's voice was quiet but sure. "You've made an enemy." Elias nodded once. "Some enemies are worth having." Her hand brushed against his arm then, fleeting but real, and she whispered, "And some promises are worth keeping." The days that followed carried the weight of storm clouds crouched just beyond the ridge. Whispers reached them from town, rumors of Apache women held on white man's land, talk of theft, talk of shame. Riders passed more often now, their stares lingering too long on the porch, their eyes sharp with judgment. Each night the sisters sat with Elias on the steps, the silence between them no longer empty, but binding. They did not need to speak their fear aloud. The pact was already sealed. If trouble came, they would face it together. One evening, as coyotes sang on the ridge, Elias broke the hush. "Harlan left me this place on a promise," he said, his voice low but firm. "Not just the land. You three as well. I won't bend, no matter what storm comes." Marisol's eyes shone in the dim light, and she placed her hand over his, strong, unshaking. "Then we will stand with you. This ranch is ours, because we make it so." Her words wove around them like a vow, stronger than any law could tear apart. The storm came first as whispers, then as footsteps. A handful of men arrived one evening, rifles across their saddles, anger in their eyes. Dawes was not among them, but his shadow stretched over their presence. Elias met them at the gate, revolver holstered, but his stance unyielding. The sisters stood behind him, silent but steady. The men spat curses, demanded the women, called them property, called the ranch a stain. Elias answered not with threats, but with calm, iron resolve. "This is their home, my home. You want to take it, you'll have to take it from me." Something in his eyes, perhaps the quiet fire of a man who had nothing left to lose but everything left to protect, held them back. Perhaps it was the sisters, no longer shadows, standing tall behind him, claiming their place as rightful heirs of their own lives. Whatever it was, the men faltered. They spat in the dust, cursed, and turned their horses. The yard fell silent once more, though the air still trembled with what might return. In the weeks after, life took root again. The fields pushed green beneath the sun. The fences held, the laughter inside the house grew freer, no longer bound by fear. The bond between Elias and the sisters deepened. Marisol's strength softened into quiet partnership, her voice steadying him when doubt gnawed at his resolve. Taya's fire became fierce loyalty, her hands unrelenting at his side. Nera's joy rang louder than ever, her laughter a healing reminder that even in the face of hatred, hope could endure. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky with fire, Elias stood with them on the porch. The land stretched wide before them, once broken, now alive, no longer empty, but filled with belonging. He looked at the sisters, Marisol with her unshaken will, Taya with her burning pride, Nera with her radiant light, and felt something rise within him he had not dared to believe in for years. A home, a family, a tomorrow worth fighting for. The sheriff would return. Hatred would find them again. But Elias knew his choice was made, carved deeper than any law could reach. Here, within these fences, something had been born that no storm could destroy. Love, fragile but fierce, had taken root in the dust of forgotten land. And as night spread across the valley, he felt not fear, but resolve, the healing certainty that he had found what his soul had wandered years to discover. The weeks that followed felt like a fragile dawn breaking after years of darkness, each day gilded with both promise and peril. Elias rose with the sun, his hands finding strength in labor, his heart steadied by the rhythm of voices that now filled the once silent house. Marisol's presence anchored him, her calm and guarded tenderness shaping the days with quiet certainty. Taya's fire flared in every task, her determination feeding his own, her laughter uncoiling like sparks that lit the air. Nera's joy drifted everywhere, her voice bright as birdsong, softening the edges of their weariness and wrapping the ranch in healing warmth. Together they formed something unspoken yet undeniable, a family born not of blood but of choice, forged by hardship, bound by love. Still, Elias carried the weight of watchfulness. Each time riders passed on the ridge, his eyes sharpened, his hand hovering near the revolver at his hip. He knew the sheriff's silence was not mercy, but delay, a storm crouching just beyond the horizon. Yet he also knew fear could not govern the soul, and so he poured his strength into the land, into the fences that rose sturdier with each nail, into the fields that pushed green beneath the sun, into the laughter that bloomed around the supper table. Life, once fractured, stitched itself back together beneath his hands and theirs. One evening, as twilight melted into violet dusk, Elias stood with Marisol by the graves behind the barn. The air was still, scented with fresh earth and wild sage. He placed his hand against the rough wood of the crosses, his voice low, steady. "I kept your promise, old man," he murmured. "I did not abandon them." Marisol's gaze lingered on him, her eyes shimmering with a strength that both tested and comforted him. "And we did not abandon you," she whispered. In her words lay something deeper than gratitude, an acknowledgment of the bond they had chosen, the healing thread that wove through them all. Inside, Taya and Nera prepared supper, their laughter drifting through the open window, carrying warmth into the cooling night. Elias turned toward the sound, his chest tightening with a sensation he had not allowed himself in a decade. Belonging. It struck him with both sweetness and ache, the realization that his wandering had ended, that this broken ranch, these scarred yet resilient women, were the very heart he had sought all along. Days bled into one another, filled with both toil and tenderness. Marisol's wary glances softened, her silence giving way to trust, her presence beside him not just obligation, but partnership. Taya's fire no longer burned against him, but with him, her strength lacing into his own until their work moved like one rhythm. Nera, light-hearted and unafraid, slipped her hand into his as though it was the most natural act in the world, her laughter scattering the last shadows of loneliness from his chest. Elias felt himself healed in their presence, not with sudden miracles, but with the slow, steady balm of love given and received in quiet ways. The world beyond their fences would always judge them, would always see sin where there was only devotion, scandal where there was only survival. But here, in the hush of the valley, they wrote their own law. Around the table at night, with lamplight flickering against their faces, Elias found the courage to say aloud what he had long known in silence. "This is our home," he said, his voice firm, his hand resting against the wood grain of the table. "No law, no man, no hatred can take that from us. We built it together. We will hold it together." Marisol's fingers closed over his hand, strong and steady. Taya's fierce eyes glowed with defiance that now carried hope rather than only rage. Nera's laughter chimed in, soft and radiant, a sound like the promise of spring. Together they nodded, no longer bound by fear but by choice. And in that moment, Elias felt the fragile weight of his vow transform into something unshakable, a life reclaimed, a family born in the most unlikely soil. As summer stretched across the land, the ranch blossomed. Grass thickened in the pastures, the barn stood firm against storms, the porch rang with laughter instead of silence. Elias stood often at dusk with the sisters beside him, the horizon painted gold, and felt the profound peace of a man who had wandered too long and finally come home. He knew shadows would always linger, that doors and men like him might return, but fear no longer hollowed him. What they had built together could not be undone by law or hate. It was carved into the land, into the graves behind the barn, into the threads of their very souls. When night fell, Elias lay beneath the stars, listening to the healing hum of voices from within the house, and allowed himself to dream of tomorrow. For the first time in 10 long years, tomorrow was not empty. It was alive, with love, with purpose, with the fragile, defiant flame of a family who had chosen each other against the world. And if this story has touched something tender within you, if it has brought you even a moment of warmth or healing, let your voice linger here. Leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so that these stories of love, resilience, and hope may continue to reach hearts that need them. Your presence, quiet though it may be, becomes part of the journey, just as the ranch, once broken, now thrives because it was not abandoned.